Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, ACQC, Governor of New South Wales, and Mr. Dennis Wilson. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure on behalf of the Australian Baha'i community to welcome you and formally open the Social Cohesion and Inclusion National Conference. To begin our formal proceedings, I would like to acknowledge and welcome Uncle Ray Minikin, who joins us online today and has kindly offered to give the acknowledgement of country. Please welcome Uncle Ray.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm here to give you an acknowledgement of country from whichever country you're on. And let me do it in this particular special way today. I'm holding in my hands here a piece of the soil from whose lands I now live on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I want to acknowledge the wisdom, knowledge, and expertise of the Gadigal ancestors and the custodianship of these lands that I now call my home. I acknowledge and recognize their ancestors whose wisdom had cared for this land for millennia. And through this soil, I recognize and acknowledge the families and children of the Gadigal clan who lived and celebrated and communed together on these lands, in this soil. I also acknowledge and recognize all the blood that was shed on these lands, either in violence or innocence. I acknowledge and recognize the elders who have come recently, who have toiled and died on these lands and left us a legacy that all people can enjoy the benefits of their labor on this soil today. I also acknowledge the responsibility I have in stewarding and caring for these lands and this soil. This responsibility now rests on my shoulders. My responsibility is to care for the land and soil upon which I now live, so that our children's children can celebrate and enjoy the fruits of this soil, so that they too can live a healthy, prosperous, and happy life on the land and soil of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge and recognize our collective responsibility that we all have to care for all the lands and soils that we have the honor to be birthed upon, to live and work upon. Let us affirm our connection to the lands we now live and work upon. Let us acknowledge our elders who worked on these lands for our benefit. And let us pledge that we too will steward the land according to the wisdom, knowledge, and expertise that we now possess, so that we can pass on to our children's children the best that our land and our soil can provide for them and their children's children. And let us also undertake together the important task to care for our Mother Earth, so that our future generations are not robbed or deprived of their rightful inheritance that is our responsibility to pass on to them, so that they can enjoy the same entitlements and benefits that we have enjoyed on these lands and in this soil we all call our home.
Thank you, dear Uncle Ray. We very much appreciate the profound sentiments that you shared in this acknowledgement of country. We are fortunate that we will see Uncle Ray again during this Friday's panel discussion. Today we are joined by Dr. Brian Adams, who will be giving a keynote address in this session. Joseph Laposta, representing the New South Wales Acting Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Minister Jeff Lee, representatives of the Australian Multicultural Council, Professor Sev Ozdowski, the Australian Multicultural Foundation, Mr. Has Dalal, the Ethnic Communities Councils, and community and faith leaders. We have come from different cities and towns across Australia, from diverse backgrounds and sectors of society, striving in our own way to contribute to the flourishing and betterment of our country. But we are all connected here today through a common conversation, the National Conversation on Social Cohesion. This conference builds on the one held in November last year. It is an opportunity to reflect together on advancements and lessons learnt, insights gained, and pathways forward. For many, social cohesion is not just an end in itself, but also a means to creating a society where its noblest aspirations can be realized. Today, we are officially launching the Creating an Inclusive Narrative publication, which is the culmination of a series of insights and experiences distilled from hundreds of participants representing communities and groups of all kinds. It conveys the vision, hopes, and aspirations of Australians to foster a socially cohesive society. This publication is a gift from the Australian Baha'i community to Australian society during our centenary year. It is the sincere hope of all those who have contributed to this consultative process that its findings and content are helpful in being applied in every neighbourhood, community, organisation, our institutions, and in government. In this session, we also have the bounty of 2 keynote addresses. The first given by Her Excellency, the 39th Governor of New South Wales. She previously enjoyed a long and distinguished law career. She served as a role model for women in law at both the state and national level. Her Excellency was made a judge of the Federal Court of Australia, the first woman to sit exclusively in that court, and was the first woman appointed to the New South Wales Court of Appeal, and subsequently the first woman to be appointed as its president. The Governor brings her deep commitment to education, youth, leadership, human rights, and social justice to her role in service of the people of New South Wales. And I would now like to invite Her Excellency to provide an address.
Thank you, Ida. To the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Australia, Dr. Brian Adams, distinguished guests all. I pay my respects to the Aboriginal peoples located in their various nations around Australia, and to their elders who are the leaders and the knowledge holders of and in their communities. I thank them for their custodianship of their land over the millennia. I also thank the Australian Baha'i community for hosting this conference, and I convey my congratulations on the centenary of the arrival of the Baha'i faith in Australia. In Australia, we like to think of ourselves as an egalitarian, easygoing society. In that context, it might be thought that a national conference on social cohesion and inclusion was a self-affirming act. However, history teaches us, amongst many things, 2 things which are particularly relevant for this conference. First, that unless we learn from the past, we will be destined to repeat the same mistakes in the future. The second is the reverse side of that coin. We cannot be self-satisfied or take what we have for granted. To do so risks being blind to the actuality of the lives of others. It is because there are others in our community that the concepts of cohesion and inclusion are vital ingredients in a national conversation. It's a large discussion and has many aspects to it. At the 3rd Advancing Community Cohesion Conference, The Way Forward, held at Western Sydney University in February this year, I referred to the work of Xavier Fonseca and others who, in their 2019 essay entitled Social Cohesion Revisited, noted that the many studies on social cohesion covered the individual and community, but they mostly missed the role of governance and formal institutions. Cohesion, they said, happens at the intersection of these 3 levels. It is that which I have been asked to address today. That is, the role of institutions and their intersection with the individual and the community. Let me commence, however, by going back 2 centuries ago and referring to the 1835 work entitled Democracy in Australia by the French political writer and aristocrat Alix de Tocqueville. This work was published after de Tocqueville had spent several months traveling throughout the United States. He had been sent by the French government to study the American prison system, but he became waylaid studying the US political, economic, and religious institutions. As Professor John Keane of the University of Sydney explains, de Tocqueville was the first political writer to bring together the newly invented modern understanding of civil society with the old Greek category of democracy. And he was the first to say that a healthy democracy makes room for civil associations in which individuals come to feel themselves to be citizens. In this theory, democracy is defined not just by elections, parties, and government by representatives, but by the extensive use of civil society institutions that prevent political despotism in the name of equality. Although democracy is heralded in the Western world, at least, as the best form of governance in a civil society, Abraham Lincoln recognized its inherent dangers, particularly in the form of political partisanship and tribalism. In his Lyceum Address of 1838, he warned that having succeeded in establishing the capability of a people to govern themselves, the challenge would be to establish government for the people. His concern was that sheer self-interest and ambition to be in power could replace government in the interests of the people. Lincoln continued that partisanship would only be frustrated by unity of the people. These notions of civil society and unity of the people are thus very much part of our democratic history. They might be described, however, as the big picture notions, the institutional functioning of society. Concepts of social cohesion and inclusion tend to look at the manner in which individuals function within communities. This can be seen, for example, in the Australian Human Rights Commission's definition of social cohesion, which they refer to as positive social relationships. And indeed, the various synonyms of cohesion, including unity and solidarity, sit happily with this definition. The Commission expands upon its definition, explaining that a socially cohesive society is one which works towards the well-being of all of its members, fights exclusion and marginalisation, creates a sense of belonging, promotes trust, and offers its members the opportunity of upward mobility. That explanation, that amplification, necessarily takes the matter beyond the individual and the community. It speaks of society. But to speak of a socially cohesive society, however, is to speak in the abstract. Societies in the abstract do not act, they do not do things. So we need to understand what we mean when we speak of society. And I would suggest this as a working definition. A society comprises individuals who function within communities, which in turn require mechanisms in which and by which to act. This brings me immediately to the work of Finesca and others, and their reference to the role of institutions. Their definition of social cohesion moves beyond what could be viewed as the aspirational notion of positive social relations, and seeks to strike at the reality of modern Western societies. They suggest that social cohesion is the ongoing process of developing well-being, sense of belonging, and voluntary social participation of the members of society, while developing communities that tolerate and promote a multiplicity of values and cultures, and granting at the same time equal rights and opportunities. This ongoing process to which they refer captures the interdependence of the individual, the community, and institutions as markers of social cohesion. The authors posit that the role of institutions within this interdependency is to provide the mechanisms for conflict management and decision-making. In other words, there needs to be mechanisms which are the governance systems of formal institutions. They argue that these mechanisms must be directed to the reduction of inequalities and exclusion. The mechanisms necessary to do this will take many forms. Obvious ones include the courts and tribunal systems, the education and the health system. Principles which govern society also feature. For my part, I consider that the rule of law is fundamental, a principle that says that no one is above the law. And as will be seen in the next two categories to which Finesca refers, there will be an overlap in the role and functions of the various institutions. So the authors next point to institutions as being what I have described as the operation centres in which human rights reside, directed to the freedom of the individual within the society. Participatory rights, such as the right to vote, are referred to by the authors in this category, indicating the right of a person to have a voice in the political representation which governs the community, namely the Parliament. The right to vote in Australia is, of course, compulsory and accordingly is not manipulatable, as is possible in countries where voting is not compulsory. For example, the right to vote can be obstructed or hindered by placing polling stations in localities that are not readily accessible, or where voting cannot take place in the allotted times. In a democracy such as India, this is managed by staggering the voting process over 7 phases, taking 37 days. Though the voting calendar is dispersed in this way, all seats in the lower house and the resulting prime ministership are announced on the same day, with strict rules preventing the sharing of data as votes are counted across constituencies. Compulsory voting, however, is a legislative recognition of our right to have the political representatives of our collective choosing. That is so fundamental, it should not be left to chance. Given that to be so, it follows that there is an obligation to provide systems which facilitate that which the Parliament has legislatively mandated. In other words, we have to have an electoral system which enables everybody to exercise their voting right in an accessible and easily recognisable way. The third issue that Finesca and his co-authors refer to is the existence of structures, norms and values, being those formal institutions and actors in society that are responsible for its upkeep. Here, once again, one can see the overlap with the previous categories that I've referred to. The structures, the norms and the values, which include Parliament as a structure, court and tribunal systems as structures, legislative enactments as norms, as well as those norms and values by which formal relationships in our community operate. For example, the law specifies the contractual relationships by which the contracts between individuals, organisations, and indeed governments in our community operate. These same norms set community standards, including, for example, as encapsulated in the criminal law, as well as the norms applicable to civil conduct. For example, the principles which determine what constitutes negligent conduct, which should be the subject of civil redress. There are other bodies of work in this field which trend in the same direction. The authors of the essay Social Cohesion, Institutions and Growth present evidence that measures of social cohesion, such as income inequality and fractionalisation, determine institutional quality. Their thesis is that the better the quality of institutions, the better the prospect for economic growth. The authors argue that the extent to which a society is inclusive, which in turn is likely to require institutional norms and governance, such as laws against discrimination, is likely to build cohesion. Again, the interdependence of the individual, the community and institutions is at play in this approach. One might ask then, how does this play out in a practical sense? The answer in a society which is fluid and multifactored is, I would suggest, it all depends on what is happening at the time. Swinburne University's Australian Leadership Index for 2020 provides an interesting contrast to the last quarter of 2019, where trust in institutions was recorded to be at a low, and in some cases as at its lowest ebb since the survey had begun. But the 2020 survey for the corresponding quarter, August to November, paints a very different picture. Trust was in the ascendancy. And I quote from the findings. First, perceptions of state government leadership for the greater good continue to improve. Secondly, the public sector continues to be judged by Australians as showing the most leadership for the greater good of all sectors. And thirdly, charities and public health institutions continue to be seen as showing exemplary leadership for the greater good. These responses very much reflected the positive public perception and assessment of the governmental and other institutional responses to the pandemic, as well as to the bushfires and the floods which preceded the pandemic earlier in the year. And a participant of one of your roundtable consultations echoed this, pointing out that a true measure of social cohesion is not when times are good, but when times are tough. In concluding its survey, Swinburne University observed that by shining a light on leadership for the greater good, this pandemic may yet have a silver lining for the future. The findings of a national ACROSS survey during the COVID-19 pandemic also showed a community sector workforce that cares deeply about the communities with which it works. And almost half agreed or strongly agreed that government had sought their advice on responses to COVID-19. In New South Wales, there is a general consensus that deeper engagement with Aboriginal communities occurred during the pandemic, with the communities themselves leading the discourse on protecting their own health. So you will see here the interdependence, the working together of individuals within communities, within institutions. It is yet to be seen, of course, whether this improvement in cross-sectoral cooperation will transfer to the longer term. Certainly, the pandemic's impact on how institutions have worked together provides a roadmap for future institutional interdependence with communities and individuals. And I would suggest that there are at least 3 signposts for how we may move forward, all of which sit at the intersection of the individual, the community, and institutions. Those 3 signposts are engagement, advisory structures, and collaboration and partnership. The premise of the model of community engagement proposed by the Australian Institute of Family Studies is that we cannot know what communities need without better understanding their aspirations, their concerns, and their values. And there is an important and corresponding benefit in individual health and well-being when participation is understood both in terms of access, that is, being included in valued social settings and activities, and in terms of agency, feeling that one is able to contribute meaningfully to those activities. And the inclusivity of the discussions that led to the excellent Baha'i document, Creating an Inclusive Narrative, based on the 50 roundtable discussions between July 2019 and September of this year, is in itself an excellent example of an institution taking the time and the steps to engage in multi-level process of discourse with people of diverse backgrounds, genders, abilities and disabilities, ethnicities, cultures and faiths. Advisory structures, for their part, could operate on various levels. At an inter-institutional level, universities, research institutes, and expert governmental organisations, such as the statutory positions of Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientist, have an important role in providing advisory structures to governments. As a body of subject matter experts, they have a tremendous capacity to be involved in the national and in the community conversation, as demonstrated in Australia's control of the pandemic, when the parliamentary leaders, the political leaders, stood behind and more often stood beside and more often a step behind the chief medical officers. And then we move to collaboration and partnerships. The importance of evidence-based approaches, collaboration, and whole of community engagement combine to give us another lesson from the pandemic. In a partnership model, institutions are better able to meet the needs of communities, essentially as a result of being better informed. Establishing an effective partnership results in a greater sense of ownership, greater take-up of services, and better outcomes. It is to be hoped that this learning will secure the existence and continuance of programs where institutional responses are found not to be the best solution, but where community-based programs, including, for example, community-based justice programs such as Marumbuka in Bourke and Sydney's Curie Court for Young Offenders, have proved to be particularly effective. In these and similar programs, positive outcomes are achieved for young individuals when the institution, in this case, the institutional justice system, enables, very important word, enables the community, in this case, the Aboriginal community, to lead in their space being the rehabilitation space. And a very different example arose early in the pandemic when a partnership was formed consisting of biomedical engineering students and staff from the University of New South Wales, the University of Sydney, and New South Wales Health, who by mid-March had consulted with the Australasian Veterinary Board Council and industry groups and had designed and produced high-spec ventilators from non-hospital resources for use by COVID-19 patients. So, in conclusion, where does that leave us? In a world where political rhetoric can be unseemly and divisive, the examples to which I refer, and there are many others, are a positive indication that we are a society where its constituent parts, individuals, community, and institutions intersect, where social cohesion is the evolving process whereby the well-being of the individual is the raison d'etre of the society. It is respect and trust which is at the heart of this topic. Respect for difference, respect which enables communities and individuals to accommodate difference, and trust that our institutions are capable of providing the framework in which that can happen. So thank you again to the organisers of this conference, which institutionally enables the conversations that need to be had and the actions that need to be taken by both individuals and communities as they function and operate within our institutions. Thank you.
Your Excellency, on behalf of everyone present at the conference, we sincerely thank you for your thoughtful acknowledgements and deeply insightful address on the role of leadership in safeguarding, promoting, and strengthening social cohesion in Australia. I found it interesting that you touched on the importance of trust, engagement, collaboration, and participation, which are themes which will run throughout this conference over the coming week, and especially the interdependence and interaction of individuals, communities, and institutions, and how you drew on examples during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is so close to our reality and many are still experiencing now. So Your Excellency, thank you very much for joining us today and being part of this conference. We are very honoured to have you with us. So friends, we are missing the energy and the view of all of you in this space. We're used to having conferences face to face, but we've had to respond creatively and still to be able to share in this journey and be part of this national conversation. So our journey as a country with social cohesion can be seen as a common path of learning that we are all contributing to together. We're all protagonists in this endeavor. A year ago, it was in this room on the grounds of the Baha'i House of Worship, where I stand today, that the need for creating an inclusive narrative was born in a forum that was held on social cohesion. Dr. Bryan Adams was part of that forum and so has been part of this journey with us from the beginning. At last year's conference, he kindly offered the closing remarks. He gave a helpful analogy about the similarity between flying or falling, similar that is, up until the point in which you stop. He posed the question, are we flying or are we falling as a nation? Have we opened our eyes enough to see if we are flying or falling in terms of our journey to create a socially cohesive society? Do we know where we are heading? Bryan joins us today to present on the end of an age of tolerance and to reflect on how our journey has progressed over the past year. Bryan is the director of the Centre for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue at Griffith University, with a background in mediation, conflict management, and dialogue facilitation. Bryan is primarily focused on promoting respect and understanding across cultural, religious, and organizational boundaries. He is the founder of the G20 Interfaith Forum, providing recommendations on issues relevant to the G20 Leaders Summit. During Bryan's address, we encourage our audience to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to write your questions for Dr. Adams. Please warmly welcome Dr. Bryan Adams.
Thank you very much, Ida. It's always a pleasure to join you. And I think the big question will be, am I flying or falling as a speaker as I address you guys today? I want to thank, first of all, the Australian Baha'i community for this invitation to be part of this, but also for their leadership, continuing to press on these issues and help us better articulate the importance and the impact of strengthening our social cohesion and becoming a more inclusive nation. Thank you, Your Excellency, for those remarks. There's a fair bit of overlap in terms of concept and points that I made with my own views and the work that I'll be doing. And so I thank you for reinforcing that and look forward to learning more from you in the future. And Uncle Ray, thank you for that wonderful acknowledgement of country. That was one of the most humble and informative acknowledgements I've seen in a very long time, and I appreciate that enormously. And distinguished ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, brothers and sisters, greetings from Queensland, the land of no daylight savings time. I'm speaking to you from Griffith University's Nathan campus, which is on the Yagar and Turrbal lands, the traditional owners of which I would like to pay my respects, and those that have passed on, those with whom we're currently working. And I hope to be able to continue to work with their up and coming leaders for many, many years to come. Now, Ida has asked that I reflect a little bit on this journey that we're making. And I have to say the last year since we had the second annual Social Cohesion and Inclusion Conference has been quite a journey. If I could see all of you, I'm sure I would see heads hung down and swinging from side to side as we reflect on some of the challenges that we faced as a nation. It seems like the most terrible fires we had throughout the country are a distant memory and even a small part of just this last year. But then, of course, the COVID-19 and the pandemic and the enormous impacts that has had. But it hasn't just been those challenges. There have been some achievements. We've learned a lot. We've been immensely fortunate in Australia relative to other parts of the world. I think of my own native land, the United States, and the challenges they continue to face. in relation to this pandemic. And it's something for which I'm very, very grateful to be in Australia at this time and part of Australia. But also a wonderful achievement is this inclusive narrative that we've just launched today and that we'll be making available to all of you and to across the nation this week. In my knowledge, this is the first national narrative project that we've produced in Australia. And as Her Excellency noted, that this is civil society led, that this is from the ground up and taking leadership as should be happening. And there have been tremendous learnings as well. I look at Queensland and some of the work that we've done when the Queensland government approached us to facilitate engagement with faith communities across the state in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. The questions were, what impact is this having? Can we work with these, with our various faith communities to better deliver messaging and learn from the many vulnerable communities that are out there? And so we came together, a number of government departments and health organizations, as well as, I think it was about 23 different faith traditions, to put together recommendations and lessons learned that the state government took on board and strengthened our broader community response to the challenges of the pandemic. And then that even went further, that continued, in which as things began to ease up, we again gathered together to write the industry plan for reopening places of worship and those guidelines that strengthen that. And that's taught us that government alone, or rather it re-emphasized the fact that government alone can't do all the work, that we need to work in partnership across our communities to help the most vulnerable and the most challenged in our society. But there are also a few concerns that we have as we do move forward. One is in relation to challenges to social cohesion. One is the reallocation of funds and resources, that as the policy shifts to a focus more towards job growth, we might set aside some of the opportunities that we've had to build networks and lines of communication, to reinforce messages of social cohesion, and shift that into job growth, which is of course important, but I don't want to leave behind some of these important structures and support that are in place or have been in place. Another concern is a fear that we might have become a bit more inward looking as a nation and in many of our communities. Many of our supply chains, for example, have been disrupted, and we try to do that all within our own country now. There's of course the onerous government surveillance that's taken place to address this. While necessary, it can challenge our social cohesion and our sense of looking outward to others. And then finally, there's simply this new normal of physical and social separation that might impede our abilities to come together in a cohesive or inclusive society. And then finally, there's the continued rise of right-wing nationalism, of which I spoke last year in the closing of the conference. And while I won't spend a lot of time on that today as the focus, I do think that much of what we say reflects on this rise in our own country and around the world. And so in moving into the body of my remarks, I titled this talk, "The End of the Age of Tolerance," not in a doomsday dark cloud moment or image, but to perhaps give us a way of looking at where we are, how we got here, and then what we may need to move forward. So many of you may realize today is actually the International Day of Tolerance, supported by the United Nations and a number of NGOs, civil society organizations, and wonderful people all around the world. And the purpose of this day is to raise the importance of tolerance, of those that are different from us, and even seek some understanding of those differences and build a stronger society. But I want to address this idea of tolerance a fair bit. What is tolerance? A friend of mine and a colleague, he's the director of Interfaith Center at Grand Valley State University in Michigan in the United States. He says tolerance is simply that you agree to do no harm. And our many, many dictionaries out there would probably define the verb to tolerate as something along the lines of to allow the existence, the occurrence, or practice of something that one dislikes or disagrees with without interference. Now, as you can see from this perspective, tolerance isn't an advisable foundation norm on which to build a socially cohesive or inclusive society. It doesn't facilitate interaction or the development of understanding. It does not allow for efforts to change that with which one may strongly disagree. For example, female genital mutilation or legalized spousal abuse. So why then is tolerance attractive? Well, one reason is it's better than hatred. So that's already a step forward. Another is it's enforceable, it's legislatable, in the sense of thou shalt not. You know, if you can stop people from doing things that they shouldn't do towards another of a different view, then there we are. So it's relatively easy. Also, tolerance as a principle it's passive. It doesn't require much of us. Some of the definitions seem to suggest it's okay, biting our tongue is the effort we may need to do, or remove ourselves from those with whom we don't agree. But it doesn't require a lot of conscious effort or work. And finally, what tolerance, it's focused on this concept of validity. And it's this last point that I want to emphasize for a bit in this speech. So a society built on tolerance is one that's focused on accepting that some person or some belief or some practice has a valid place in our society, however undesired or desirable that may be. And my favorite philosopher / computer scientist, Jonathan Zunger, he puts it this way. He says, tolerance is a peace treaty. Tolerance is a social norm because it allows different people to live side by side without being at each other's throats. It means that we accept that people may be different from us in their customs, in their behavior, in their dress, in their sex lives, and that if it doesn't directly affect our lives, well, it's none of our business. But the model of a peace treaty differs from the model of a moral precept in one simple way. The protection of a peace treaty only extends to those willing to abide by its terms. And so when I say that we seem to be seeing the end of the age of tolerance, is we seem to be seeing an increased legitimacy in those who are unwilling to abide by the terms of tolerance, of this peace treaty that Jonathan would say. We're seeing increasing polarization, which leads to less civility towards those who are different from us. We're seeing an increased public legitimacy of far right or left extremism and their views. Now, this is different from an increasing number of those holding those views. I'm saying an increased public legitimacy for those views. We're seeing increasing nationalism and populism. And so it seems that we might be reaching the end of this age of tolerance. Well, what do I mean by this age of tolerance? First of all, so we can define that loosely here. So some would say that the treaties of Westphalia were where this age of tolerance could say it started. So that's where, after many years of war between primarily Catholic and Protestant interests, An agreement was reached allowing each jurisdiction, or nation state, as they became to be known as broadly, to decide its own religion. But that was in general a separation of church and state, not an acceptance of the valid presence of different religions in society. So I wouldn't say that that's where our age of tolerance began. I would actually point to the signing of the UN Declaration on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in just a couple of weeks will be celebrating its 72nd anniversary. So we've had several generations raised in this period. So with verbiage such as all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, or whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. We began to recognize as valid that there are great differences around the world, and that those differences need to be protected. We begin to recognize increasing diversity related to this. But one of the other characteristics of this marvelous declaration, this document, foundational document to much of what we do today in our Western liberal societies, is that it had a lack of instruments or process for engaging with this increasing difference. In particular, as I would say, a lack of dialogue or interaction. So it provided a framework for society to recognize that other views, beliefs, and practices were valid, but we still needed help on how to engage with these different views. So if this age is ending, why is it ending? Why is there an increase in the legitimacy of views that reject the valid place in society of others? Well, I would say one of the reasons is that we're seeing a clash, not a clash of civilizations necessarily, but of systems and of movements. So diversity happens because our world is one of increasingly intimate interaction between cultures, worldviews, political ideologies, and economic systems. These interactions, though not new, I mean, this has been happening for a long time, of course, they are exceptional today in the speed of their development and the depth of their impact upon our lives. One might say we're drowning in diversity, but we don't have the tools or the paradigms or the social norms for engaging with it because we're focused on being tolerant. So what do we do? Where do we go? Do we just watch it fall apart? Or do we try to recognize these challenges and design a way to address them? So I submit to you, to address the problems we're facing, to thrive in the global conditions in which we now live, we should move from a foundation of tolerance of different views to a foundation of respect of different views. That we not only accept as valid the presence of diversity, but that we learn to value the contributions of diversity. Now, as I hinted at earlier, this requires skills, it requires instruments, it requires personal and moral strength. And also, it requires leadership. I think Her Excellency touched upon this, but also, most importantly, demonstrated the value of this type of leadership. And I think, again, Australia is fortunate to have leaders such as her in times such as this. So I want to turn the rest of my time with my remarks on this idea of leadership. Briefly touch upon this. Specifically, what is inclusive leadership? What is leadership that would help us build an inclusive society? Now, the reason why I want to focus on leadership versus a number of other ways to approach this challenge is because I'm speaking to national leaders. Most of you that attend that are participating or attending in this conference are community leaders, political leaders, opinion leaders in various settings such as media and education. And therefore, I want to speak to you specifically. So leadership matters because for four reasons. One, leadership matters because it provides a focus for policy development and public action. Two, leadership matters because it is able to commit funding and other resources, including reputation and legitimacy, to address these articulated issues. Number three, leadership matters because it works to frame or interpret the issue in ways that bring together a broad range of societal groups to engage the issue, rather than, say, focus on one particular interest group or to even work to divide them. And then finally, leadership matters because it's an opportunity to represent a figurehead to whom others can turn for mobilizing, for modeling of norms, of values, and of aspirations. So it's this idea, these 4 points of leadership provides focus, funding, framing, and a figurehead. But how do these 4 characteristics or opportunities of leadership relate to this overall thesis that inclusive leaders can help us engage with difference, to build respect? So I say inclusive leadership is a particular style of leadership. And I would like you, leaders of our nation, to reflect on your style of leadership and how it relates to inclusivity. So inclusive can often be seen as not excluding any of the parties or groups involved in something. But to me, that's a bit too passive, and that's not leadership. I argue that an inclusive leader is actively seeking to expand the source from which a person can make potential contributions to a group, to an organization, or to society. So inclusivity is the practice of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those having physical or mental disabilities or belonging to other minority groups. So in other words, inclusivity means engaging with difference. Therefore, inclusive leadership is leadership that engages explicitly with difference. And then also, inclusive leadership moves beyond tolerance and targets and focuses on respect and impact through increasing the value of the contributions of this diversity. It has a goal for society's members to feel they have a valid and valued place, be that within our organization, within our communities, or within society broadly. So in closing, I want to give you what I think, what I propose is 4 principles to guide this type of leadership. So if explicit, deep engagement with difference or diversity is our role as inclusive leaders, how do we do this? How do we build an environment in which it is safe to engage with these differences, to allow your own personal identities and differences or diversity to be used as contributors or contributions to facing challenges? So we inclusive leaders must model and promote in our spheres of influence at least these 4 principles. And these principles are bravery, integrity, curiosity, and finally, humor. And I put these 4 out there because engagement isn't simply about being nice and expecting others to think, oh, that person is nice, I'm going to trust them and open up to them, or get to know them. Engagement is about us reaching out to others, but also finding ways to bring them in, to work with us. And frankly, reaching out to others in challenging times isn't easy. And it takes bravery many times in our life to do that. But bravery isn't enough. That's usually an act that helps us overcome obstacles to reaching out to others, right? But what sustains that bravery, what makes it courage and part of a broader movement, is that we do this with integrity. We know who we are, we know what our values are, and that bravery combined with integrity allows us to have courage to reach out to others, to challenge structures that are within our society or our organization or even our communities, so that we can reach others. But that in and of itself isn't enough to bring others in. That helps us overcome our obstacles, but how do we help them overcome whatever obstacles they may have or hesitations to want to engage with us? And that's where the principles of curiosity and humor come in. Curiosity is, one way we can define it, is it's a desire to learn from others. But it's more than that when we're talking about engaging respectfully with another. It's actually an affirmative act where we are saying, look, you have something I don't have. And that, I think there's value in that. And I would like to learn from you. So please share that with me. That's what curiosity in engagement is. We can be curious and go online and learn about things, or we can talk to those that we know really well to get their opinion of somebody else. But that's not curiosity in terms of engagement. And it actually helps when configuring some of the power disparities that we have in working with minority groups and allowing them a voice in our decision-making processes. And humor also is very important. And I say this because, this is challenging work. We can get down, or we can take ourselves very, very seriously. But cohesion and inclusivity also has to be enjoyable. So I'm not just simply saying, oh, let's crack a few jokes or something like that. But it's humor. It requires a bit of humility on our part. It's recognizing that we're going to make mistakes as we move forward, as we try to understand this other culture or this worldview or this perspective. But also humor, it's a cultural universal. All cultures have humor. And as we engage with that humor, we better understand the underlying assumptions and traditions and values that they have. And we're demonstrating an appreciation of that and a desire to learn of that and to apply that. And so I'm saying, if we want as leaders to be inclusive leaders, we want to be able to reach out to others as well as bring them in. As we do this with bravery and with integrity, as we evince curiosity and good humor, we'll build social cohesion in those areas in which we have influence. We will strengthen inclusivity and better, how can I close with this? We will strengthen the value that others can bring in their contributions to our society. I thank you very much for this opportunity to share these thoughts with you and to join with you at the opening of this, what I see as absolutely essential conference and gathering and discussions that we'll have this week.
Brian, thank you for your address. We'll have you stay on because now we will start our Q&A. And we've had some questions come through. I especially appreciate how you are helping us think about, what is tolerance, and to have that opportunity to reflect on how we are advancing, how we need to advance further. And one thing that really stood out to me personally was how you spoke about how we're drowning in diversity. Our reality has shifted and changed so much that we've been able to experience and engage with many people of diverse backgrounds, and we're learning how to do that. And, do we have the mechanisms to do that effectively? And I was thinking, at the level of how we think about one another at that foundational level, I was wondering whether, how a broader sense of identity or a definition of identity, a broader definition of identity can help us move beyond this superficial acceptance of diversity. So maybe if you could start with that.
Yeah, that's what you've done is you've highlighted the importance of this inclusive narrative project, and it's in which we're not trying to artificially create a broad identity, but what the project has tried to do is tease out or pull out the threads of what we see our identity as being, and then weaving them together into this narrative. And so for us to I think to be a sustainably cohesive society, that's the approach we have to take as we try to broaden our identity. It's not in trying to create something that we then sell to the masses, but rather it's something that in collaboration with and respectful listening to and a lot of work create that identity together. And because our societies are so dynamic, we continue to change. That's an ongoing process. It's not something that's done once, however difficult it is, and then left to be referred to.
Thank you. I'll take it now to a question which has come from our audience, and they've asked, you mentioned that we need new values to move beyond the limitation of tolerance. What values do you think are helpful for leaders to have, but also for individuals in their day-to-day lives?
Yeah, that's why did we have to start with such a challenging question? That's
we have deeply thoughtful audience with us.
Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a broad set of values. I would say there's perhaps one or two that will get us a long way. In fact, I rarely speak of values in terms of common or shared or universal values. I often speak of aspirations. We have common and shared aspirations. And it's those aspirations, as we recognize others having, that can bind us together, or that can connect us rather in ways that help us move forward towards achieving those aspirations. But getting back to values, I think some of the primary values that we can develop, we can use in our daily life, we can ask our leaders to have, is that of listening to others, of being willing to listen to others. And that's and to value that opportunity. That's immensely difficult because as we listen to those that are different, who hold very deeply the views and beliefs that they have, we are by nature going to be challenged in those that we hold very deeply and personally. And so we're asking someone, in essence, to even if they're not attacking us or even questioning our own set of values, we are, in a sense, when we listen to them, asking them to challenge how we believe or how we act or how we or what has led us to where we are today. And that's very challenging. But that's one that I would be happy to put out there broadly for all. Mm-hmm.
speak about storytelling, we actually have another comment and question. Someone has said, great talk of storytelling, and are such events that provide an opportunity to tell stories useful and productive in this area of social cohesion? And is there much research that you know of about social cohesion and storytelling?
Yes and yes to both of those questions. Yes, storytelling is absolutely essential. I wouldn't say it's just valuable or useful. I would say it's essential in moving us forward, and it's important for a number of reasons. One, we have a whole body of research called Deliberative Democracy, in which there's an emphasis on rational engagement and exchange between individuals or groups to come to certain decisions. But an overemphasis on rationality in speech, in writing, or communication in general actually marginalizes a fair number of potential participants in that. There are many in which storytelling is the way that they primarily communicate their values, their beliefs, but also how they make particular points. And I'll share you an example from my own life. I used to live in Tanzania when I was younger, and I lived with the Mfundo family. And the time that I was there with them over a summer, I taught in the little school that Mama Mfundo had in their backyard. And I also spent a lot of time with her. So she was my best mate, Mama Mfundo. But one thing I would do is I would follow her into the kitchen. And I didn't realize at the time, but that was something that I shouldn't have done. And one day she sat me down and she told me a story. And the story she told me was of this man and woman who were married. And after several months, there began to be this rumor going around the community that he was a very jealous man. And I'm listening and having no clue why she's telling me this story, but it's a very interesting story. And the final conclusion was, she said, and the reason why they felt he was jealous was because he would even follow her into the kitchen. And that's when I realized, okay, this is in this culture, in this space, that is not the zone where I should be allowed to be going, and that is her space. And so telling me this story, rather than saying, hey, Brian, you know what, you shouldn't come in here for these reasons and all of this, it would look, however it's interpreted. He told me a story. And that's actually very, very commonplace throughout the world. That's actually the majority of the world's citizens communicate in a storytelling rather than an argument or a rationally structured way. So that is one reason why storytelling is absolutely essential. But also storytelling is important in this work because it again, like I mentioned with curiosity or humor, it's a way of reconfiguring power differences in group dynamics. And then finally, is there research in there? Yes, there's quite a bit of research around the importance of storytelling, again, in deliberative democratic theory. There's research in storytelling and peacekeeping or peacemaking, peace building as well. So there's a good body of literature out there with some wonderful lessons learned, best practices, and great examples also.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It brings to my mind how much stories can share insights that maybe we are not so conscious of, that maybe hasn't been brought to the fore of our realizing that some habits or roles, even ways in which we think about society are not so obvious to us. And so these stories can help really bring that to the fore and help us rethink about how we operate and behave and interact with one another. it maybe also along this lines, you know, there's questions coming through about whether you know of an inspirational role model or role models who lead with courage, integrity, or humor that you can share with us.
Let me see. Yes, there are many, and I've tried to know as many of them as I can. One that comes to mind very quickly is Professor Ross Hummel here at Griffith University. He's in the School of Criminology, but he's a man who has led with throughout his career with an enormous amount of integrity and courage, bravery at times, but who also is, through his curiosity and his humor, able to engage with many people, not just students in his lecturing, but the mentoring he's done for others, such as myself. Another one that comes to mind is another local, and that's Lenine Ford, OAM. She's the former chancellor of Griffith University and the former governor of Queensland, who, you know, of course, is an eminent person in our society here, but who also has taken a personal interest in my own family and shown kindness and learning, even though we're of a different religious background. And so those are two that come to mind very quickly. I don't think you want to unleash me on this, because I could probably go on for quite a while. Asmi Wood at the ANU, for example, is another one, and on and on. But yes, very fortunate that I know many of them, but the world is fortunate that there are many out there who do demonstrate these principles, these practices.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that. I was also wondering, you know, you've been the director at the Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue at Griffith University for a number of years now. And I was hoping that you can maybe speak to the role that such spaces, such as your centre, play in strengthening social cohesion. Because to me, such spaces are so important. And do we have enough in our country? And how can the average person or someone who's maybe not a director at a particular centre create such spaces?
Okay. Well, if I can be frank, Ida, you asked this question at a very sensitive time, I must say. It's the center is challenged, its existence is challenged because of the financial costs that COVID has placed upon the university, and we're trying to find out how the center can survive with the financial demands that are upon the university. And so I might actually be answering that question in which someone who isn't a director is trying to create spaces like this. So we'll see where that goes. But it's some of the value. So I would say I'll start at the end and work my way back through the questions you have. So first of all, no, there aren't enough of these spaces out there. Absolutely not. And we need more of them. And some of the value of spaces like this, one of the things that captured me about the opportunity when I applied for this position of the center, it's been 9.5 years now that I've been here, was that we had the potential to establish something that could bridge divides, that could facilitate the work of other bridge builders out there. So we're a center that does interfaith and intercultural dialogue and engagement on a public university campus that allows us to bridge secular faith divides, intercultural challenges and divides, structures such as government and policing and education with other new migrant communities or religious communities out there. It allows us to bridge the academic, non-academic world as well, as we bring community and scholarship together to face challenges. And it provides, the center itself provides, so not just this conceptual space to bridge, but it's actually a physical space. We have a center here where we can bring people together. it's not neutral in the sense that, well, we don't care how it goes either way or anybody, but it's a safe space where all who do come here, I sure hope they recognize that they're here and able to contribute what they have. That's some of the value of having spaces like this, and we need more of them throughout Australia and the world. This is unique in many ways in our region, the center.
Yes, I note that you have also created dialogue spaces at the G20 Interfaith Forum, so on that international scale every year, and how valuable this is from the grassroots at the neighborhood level through to that arena as well, and where such profound and thought-provoking and transformational dialogue can take place. And I really wish you well in continuing to create these spaces, whether it be at Griffith University and everywhere else. And I really encourage also others to do so. That's one thing that we found in the Inclusive Narrative Project, that the creation of such roundtable spaces, which are really humble in nature, really led to deep connections and advancement in understanding and appreciation for the diversity and a respect for the diversity that we have, but also the realization that we can contribute to advancing our country together and shaping a society in which we can be proud of, that is built on, you know, noble aspirations, on principles and values, and a vision that is something greater than we see today. And I really appreciate that you have been a part of this. If it's okay, I might ask you one last question from our audience. So they've asked, how can we adjust our systems of governance to better foster leadership with those qualities that you spoke of: courage, integrity, curiosity, and humor?
I love this question. This is and this is one of the advantages. So Her Excellency, she spoke about democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville and his innovation in political thought of bringing this idea of civil society and governance together, right? Remember that in her remarks. And that's a powerful point that should be highlighted when we're answering a question like this, as I see it, in that our systems of governance that we have, there are two things we can do to help build these principles or these values into these systems. One is recognize that Australia is made up of, Australian communities are made up of a number of governance structures. And many of the tensions we find between different communities or between different worldviews are around governance issues. I know I'm from a political science background, so maybe I'm somewhat biased in how I see this. But governance is simply a system of working with a broad populace and directing that the work and direction of that populace. That's a broad way of looking at governance. And there are different ways of framing how to do that. So recognizing that there are different governance structures in Australia, different ways of governing a populace and moving the work of that populace in a particular direction is important. And then how do we take that recognition and then weave these values into it? Well, that's the strength of having a democratic system, which we can hold our leaders accountable in principle. And in practice, we don't do a great job of that, actually, I think, in Australia and many other republics or democratic republics around the world, such as the United States. But I think that's where we need to do. We should work to, one, elect those that we feel will, but two, demand of those who do lead us that this is the value system by which we want you to govern. And we'll make that clear in what we say and what we do, but also when we vote. So those are some of my thoughts on how to do that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Brian, I would like to thank you for presenting at the conference today. And for those of you who have joined us, we've brought together throughout the week speakers and presenters such as Brian, who are really thinking very deeply about strengthening social cohesion in our country, but also thinking about our future, our long-term future as a country, and the type of country that we wish to shape together on principles and values that we've spoken of today in all the areas that we live in, towns and neighborhoods and cities. So we encourage you to please join us for the other sessions that are happening throughout the week. And those times can be found on the conference website as well as the Humanitics registration page. And for those of you who are joining us tomorrow, there will be breakout sessions in which we would like you to go back to your registration email pack and to choose which breakout discussion theme you would like to join. Now, they are on the areas that were covered in the Inclusive Narrative publication, such as the role of education, the role of neighbourhoods in creating a socially cohesive society, building resilient communities. So we'd love to bring you all together, because I think that that's one thing that we're missing really in this COVID reality, this ability to interact with one another. So we were very conscious about that and wanted to create these breakout rooms after our presentations and panelists throughout the week. So please join to also share your learning and experience. And that is really the point of this conference, to be learning from one another and to be interacting with those across the country who also have these noble aspirations. So once again, I'd like to thank the Governor of New South Wales, Dr. Brian Adams, our distinguished guests, and also all of you for joining this opening session. And we look forward to seeing you again in the sessions running throughout the week, and wishing you a very good day. Thank you.